Technically, it wasn't a wilderness, but it was certainly a wasteland. Nearby construction projects in 1983 had demolished the site of the YMCA that had existed on that block in Melbourne, Australia. For the next 30 years, that 23,000 square foot parcel remained a demolition site with piles of deteriorating debris, collecting garbage and weeds. Then in the fall of 2013, John Noster and Millie Catlin joined with the local art district to bring life to the lot. For over 4 weeks, they pulled weeds and cleaned up garbage. They recruited volunteers who helped them haul away some of the demolition debris and repurpose the rest. They brought in reclaimed pallets and arranged them as gardens, tables, and seating areas. There were 3 shipping containers that were fashioned into a temporary stage, a bar, and into an artist studio. One of the concrete walls on an adjoining building was cleaned and refurbished so it could be used as a projection screen. The outdoor space is now known as the testing grounds and is a place for development and experimentation by the community. Despite these improvements, the testing grounds still appear closer in image to a wilderness than to a developed urban area. It still has that look of being in progress, as all the structures are clearly mobile and temporary. Among the new vegetation and the pallet gardens, you can find a car stereo, a mobile film projector, a compost heap, as well as Kelpie, the resident dog. This site is currently being used to test just about any idea people in the community can think of, from eclectic experiments in art to horticulture. Over the past year, it's been the host of a variety of artist-in-residence programs, of bike hires, design studios, even a Cajun dance class, and of course, those regular film screenings. It's even joined with traditional art galleries and museums of the area to be one of the sites for citywide events, such as the annual Night Art. It's become a place where people can go to explore, to challenge, and to grow. Noster and Caitlin hope to continue the testing grounds through at least the fall of 2015, so surrounding neighborhoods and art communities can continue to explore as well as experiment with their own possibilities. Our reading from Exodus today describes another desolate place that seemingly becomes a sort of testing ground. In fact, Moses names the spot Mesa, which at its root in the Hebrew means to put to the test. And he also calls it Meribah, which comes from the root for dispute. For once again, Moses feels himself caught between the people and God. It's the 3rd time since fleeing from Egypt that the people have come to Moses complaining about a lack of food and water. At least the last time they complained about a lack of water, a possible source had been evident, even though it was contaminated. This time, there isn't a drop in sight. All that is around them is dry, seeming wasteland, the land which Moses has brought them to. And at least in Egypt, when they were slaves, they knew eventually they would be given food and water. For after all, what good is a slave who dies from hunger or thirst? So here they confront Moses. Did you bring us here to die? Now, over the years, I've heard this story characterized in many ways as a story about ingratitude, chastising those refugees for how they forgot the good of being freed from slavery and instead they focused on the bad. And over the years, in sermons or Sunday school lessons, I've seen this group of people described variously as whiny, complaining, self-centered, ungrateful, and petty. Calvin went so far as to say the people are neglecting God's promise and making God a liar. One contemporary commentator writes, "Blessings were not enough. They wanted their needs and desires fulfilled immediately." He describes them as if they were petulant children whining for a toy that they saw advertised on TV. And many a sermon or Sunday school lesson has focused on how this was yet another test of faith that the people failed. So the moral is too often reduced to be careful that you're not as ungrateful to God as the people were here, or we should trust God more than those who followed Moses. The book of Exodus is often described as a story of how the people continually fell away from God and failed the test. And it's only by God's unending patience and grace that they get yet another unmerited chance. The difficulty I have with these perspectives is that they all look back at the story with hindsight. We know the ending. Water will be found in the rocks, and the people won't die of thirst. We know that the people are cared for and cared by God for over 40 years until they eventually get to the Promised Land, where they claim their identity as Israel. So in the face of knowing such care and blessing, how dare they put first Moses and then through Moses, God to the test? And often implied by this perspective is shame on us if we do the same when we find ourselves in trying circumstances. But what if there is a different way to look at this story? One that comes from within the boundaries of the story itself as it happens, from within the experience of the people right then, instead of from an outside perspective that knows how it all ends. What if we put ourselves there, in the middle of the wilderness, no visible water? They are tired. They are thirsty. And not just the thirsty that a glass of water is going to quench, but close to dehydration, with limbs heavy and perhaps not even able to perspire anymore. Picture yourself there. Not only you, but surrounded by your loved ones who are experiencing the same thing. And you're helpless to provide, to give them this basic need. And then remember that as descendants of Jacob, these Hebrew people were originally honored as part of Joseph's family for his part in saving the Egyptian people from the famine that consumed the surrounding nations. But then time had passed, generations had come and gone, leaders changed, and those memories faded. The Hebrews then found themselves as slaves in this land where they were once welcomed. When they started to become too numerous, the government undertook a calculated campaign to exterminate their newborn boys. And then, to make matters worse and their lives harder, they are denied the use of straw as they make the bricks that they are required and forced to make by the Egyptians, making it almost impossible to do. And so here they are now, after a long and costly struggle for freedom. Now they find themselves in the wilderness. And they're led by this man, Moses, who once lived as a son of the very Pharaoh that they're fleeing from. As if struggling in the wilderness to survive isn't enough, the people are also struggling to form a new identity as a community as well. Is it really selfishness or lack of faith that they are expressing? Or is it something else? Notice that the narrator doesn't say that God is exasperated or even annoyed. That's Moses who is. Instead, God leads Moses to what has already been promised. In the limestone of the area is naturally occurring water, springs that will spring up when the crust is broken. It's not a matter of God divinely raining down from heaven what they need. It's opening Moses and the people's eyes here to what is already there, just below the surface. What if this wilderness time isn't a time where God tests the people to prove if they will remain faithful? What if it isn't a testing ground by God for the people, but instead a proving God, for the people? Then this story becomes a place and a time for God to help them live into the reality that they are cared for and loved by God. No longer is the book of Exodus a book about people continually failing a test and falling away from God and having to be given another chance. It becomes a story of the incredible faithfulness of God that goes beyond human understanding and experience. It becomes a story not of quarreling and testing, but of God's love and providing grace. For here in the wilderness, the people are challenged to explore and experiment with who they are becoming. They are learning how to live in a different way. No longer are they slaves, but they aren't quite yet this nation that they are becoming, the people called Israel. So similar to the testing grounds in Melbourne, the wilderness time in Exodus can be viewed with its challenges as a place to explore their possibilities, to experiment and be challenged and grow as a people in relationship with each other and in their relationship with God. Here they are shown that even when they are in their deepest fears, even when it feels as if God has abandoned them, the Lord is not only with them, but leading them through. We may not face in our lives true starvation or dehydration, but the odds are we'll all face a time when in our own anxiety and fear, we become so strong that it builds to the point that our lives become parched and dry. There may come a time when we look around and see that our job has been eliminated, that rent is due and we're unemployed, and start to feel that thirst. It may start to feel as if sand is building in our own mouths when we hear the words, "The diagnosis is not good," or we receive the call that starts off with, "I'm sorry, but your child, your spouse, your parent." And it may come as a community, arriving when a meeting opens with, "We don't know how we can afford this," or we are told by the news that the nation is threatened by or under attack by. If this is no longer a story of how people failed, but becomes a story of God's love. It's a story we can turn to in those times. We can turn to it and listen as it tells us that fear and anxiety that we are experiencing in those moments are human and normal. We can witness the mundane normalcy of asking, is the Lord among us or not at those times? That we're not unusual, and it doesn't display a distressing lack of faith. For we see God's reaction, and then we can hear again and be reminded of God's faithfulness that is always there, responding with love, even as we question, even in those times of doubt, walking us through until we find those oases, those places where we can get our own thirst satisfied and where we too discover God's love is more faithful than we can imagine. Amen. The words of the hymn that we just sang were written by Ruth Duck in 1974 to the tune of Lead On, O King Eternal. And probably my favorite line of it is the first line of the second stanza, where she says, lead on, O fiery pillar, we follow yet with fears. Too often, we think that we aren't supposed to have fear or doubt in our faith, and that if we do, something is wrong. But I think the stories that we have, such as the ones from Exodus, remind us that God almost expects us to have those moments and those doubts. So it's not just Moses out in the wilderness, alone, going to found the nation of Israel. It's a community of people that God has gathered to travel together, to hold each other up, and to walk together through those doubts and fears. And those are the communities of faith that God still continues to call together here and throughout the world, in many shapes and sizes and forms and in different expressions. Because they are yet again another way that God provides for us in those times when life is dry and parched, and we wonder, is God with us? That we have the opportunity to look around and see in each face, in each hand, in each phone call or email, that yes, God is with us and has given us those who can walk with us until we, once again, know that in our hearts and in our faith. We are loved for and cared for no matter what by God. Let us go out and live that good news this week. Amen.